Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture on qualitative research. In this lecture there's a few objectives. Firstly, after watching this lecture and the supplemental readings and videos, I'm hoping that you will be able to understand the characteristics of qualitative research. I'm hoping after this lecture you should be able to name and explain qualitative traditions, that you should be able to articulate the process of data collection in qualitative research, mainly done through interviews, and that you should understand a basic method of data analysis in qualitative research. So this might be new to some of you. You may never have read a qualitative research study before. My goal is to just introduce this to you so that you'll understand how qualitative research is different than non-qualitative or quantitative research, and also understand that it is a valued and recognized method of doing research. To overview our lecture, we're going to define qualitative research through a comparison with quantitative research. We will talk about where qualitative research comes from. We'll look at some qualitative procedures in terms of how we select our participants, how we collect and analyze our data, and also look at the trustworthiness issue, which is similar to the concept of threats to internal and external validity in quantitative research. We'll discuss what makes a qualitative study robust, or what makes a qualitative study good. And then at the end of this lecture, we'll extend this into looking at mixed methodology research designs that are very powerful because they combine the best elements of quantitative research with the best elements of qualitative research. The trade-off is that they're very labor intense. So I would encourage you to watch this lecture, watch the videos, the YouTube videos that are linked on Blackboard, and some of them are kind of humorous videos or cartoons to try and lighten this up a little bit. Also, read the chapter in the textbook. It's chapter 10 in the 5th edition of Conducting Research in Kinesiology, and go through that chapter, and I think if you do all those things and start putting stuff together, that you'll have a good understanding and an appreciation of qualitative research. So my first few slides are going to show some examples of qualitative research studies that have been done in our area. This study, titled Athletic Injury Experience, a Qualitative Focus Group Approach. And you can see here the purpose of this study was to describe the athletic injury experience, focusing on the meaning of the injury from the perspective of injured athletes and student athletic trainers. The qualitative focus group method was utilized, with the main data coming from the transcribed interactions of participants. So you can see here already that we're talking about collecting a different type of data. We're not measuring something, we're not putting a number to something that can be analyzed statistically. We're asking for people's opinions or perspectives, beliefs or views. And once we start getting into those kind of data, we're moving away from quantitative to qualitative. Here's one that I've done before. Most of my research has been quantitative. However, I have done a few qualitative studies when the research question lent itself to a qualitative approach. The impact of the Stirrup-Some Fun Therapeutic Horseback Riding Program, a qualitative investigation. So my wife and myself helped out in this therapeutic riding horseback program for children with special needs. And the people who ran that program came to me and said, can you do a study to show that, you know, this program works? And I said, sure. And we could have done a quantitative study. We could have measured pre to post test variables such as flexibility of the kids, gait patterns of the kids, self-esteem of the kids, all things that can be measured through quantitative measures. However, what we wanted to do was find out, we wanted to speak to the children and to their parents to find out their perceptions of the program and what they thought of the program. So that led us to a qualitative study. So the purpose of this study was to investigate the perceived impact of a therapeutic riding program on children with mild to moderate mental disabilities and physical disabilities. Two groups of participants, including 5 children, so you can see we got a small sample size here, which is kind of inherent in qualitative research. And at least one parent of each of the 5 children were interviewed. Another big component of qualitative research, to investigate the impact of the Stirrups and Fun riding program. Qualitative data analysis procedures were used to explore participants' views and opinions of the program. And then in the abstract I went on to talk about some themes that emerged. So this is from the world of rec therapy, although you'll see that qualitative research is very common in all the therapeutic fields. Less common in exercise science, because in exercise science most of the research is quantitative, because we're usually measuring some kind of physical response or physiological response to exercise. However, it is becoming more common in all of our fields under the kinesiology umbrella. The Black Ferns, the experiences of New Zealand's elite women rugby players. The purpose of this study was to gain insight into the experiences of the New Zealand women's rugby team, the Black Ferns. Data were collected via semi-structured interviews, which was then analyzed with the assistance of Hyper Research, a qualitative data analysis package. So again, here they wanted to look at perceptions and experiences, so that's why they chose a qualitative research study. There are different types of software out there now. They used Hyper Research. I've got a different program on my computer that allows you to put transcribed interviews in, and the software package picks up certain things in those transcriptions. Forced retirement from elite football in Australia. Again, coming out of the rehab setting. This was the Centre for Rehab, Exercise and Sports Science. And this was similar to the other one in that they were looking, they were conducting in-depth interviews with 30 recently retired players and looking at their perceptions. Here's one from the main journal in Exercise Science, Research Quarterly, and their title was Sport Injury and Illness. Elite skiers describe their experiences. Okay, so you can see a pattern emerging here. When it's people talking about their experiences or the perceptions, then qualitative research appears to be a well-used research methodology. Another article from Research Quarterly. This one was called The Career Planning, Athletic Identity and Student Role Identity of Intercollegiate Student Athletes. Long title, but anyway. Their purpose was to examine the career planning of university student athletes and relationships between their career planning and athletic and student role identities. 2 in-depth interviews were held with 4 male and 4 female student athletes. Participants entered university, blah blah blah. So you can see here that again, smaller sample size, data collected through in-depth interviews. Sports psychology. The parent-coach / child-athlete relationship in youth sport. Cordial, contentious, or conundrum. And here they took 6 boys in U12 competitive soccer, interviewed them. Similar questions were posed to father coaches and 2 teammates, and they used a data analysis procedure called inductive content analysis, which we'll talk about throughout this lecture. So they felt that this research study couldn't be answered with a quantitative design, which is why they chose to move to a qualitative design and interviews. So all of our journals in our area accept qualitative research. Some of these have higher impact factors than others. For example, this journal here is one of the hardest journals to get published in our area. Research Quarterly is also a hard journal to get published within our area. So is the Journal of Teaching Physical Education. They only take the cream or the best type of research. But all of these journals accept studies that have used a qualitative research design. So let's start talking about how you do a qualitative research study. We need to understand that there are numerous types of research designs, even under the qualitative research umbrella. There's multiple methodologies, strategies, approaches, and data analysis techniques. When we talk about research design, we're talking about the framework which guides the collection of data. It's the blueprint of the study. It's how you're going to conduct the study. The research proposal that you are writing or producing the PowerPoint for this class is kind of a research design. It's the blueprint of how you would conduct the study if you actually did it. The research design is always determined by the research question. Your research question always guides you to the appropriate design. You do not go into this process stating, I want to do a qualitative study. Now what kind of questions can I ask? That's back to front. Your research question comes first, and then you move from there to deciding which fork in the road to go down. Do I go down qualitative, down quantitative, and then from there there'll be further forks in the road for different types of design under each of those umbrellas. The research design also specifies things such as what are the variables to be measured, who is your population, and what is your sampling method, and what is your method of observation. How are you going to collect data in your study? To understand a qualitative research design, I like to compare it to the traditional experimental design or quantitative design. And we've talked about these steps: defining your problem, reading relevant literature, developing testable hypotheses or research questions, and then devising a methodology that includes a discussion of participants, measurements, procedures, and your design. From that, you come up with your results and findings. You relate that to your research questions and your research hypothesis and your null hypothesis, and then you discuss your findings, tying it back into your initial problem and comparing it to the review of literature that you conducted. So that's a traditional experimental design, and that comes from the scientific world. So in that traditional experimental design, we're looking to try and establish a relationship between variables, between independent variables and dependent variables. While we are doing that, we need to make sure that we eliminate all other types of variables to be able to say that it was the impact of the independent variable that had or created the change in the dependent variable. In the traditional quantitative research design, that often leads us into conducting studies, as we've discussed in our last lecture, with experimental groups and control groups with independent dependent variables. So a classical experimental design, and this is a review from the last lecture, in a quantitative study might look like this. Two groups, an experimental group and control group, both pre-tested. The experimental group gets the treatment, the control group doesn't, and then we compare pre-test to post-test on the experimental group and then the two post-test scores statistically. So let's switch gears a little bit, and to those of you that have some kind of research and statistical background, this might come as a little bit of a leap of faith. I remember vividly when I was in graduate school, I did a minor in statistics in my PhD, and I had to take 6 classes, 18 hours of classes. 4 of them were in quantitative research. 2 of my stats classes were in qualitative research. And after taking 3 quantitative stats classes, it was kind of really shocking to then walk into a qualitative research class. So we move in a completely different direction. What? Non-quantitative research? Research without numbers? Data collection where we don't put a number to something so we can do stats on it? That's the reaction of some people to qualitative research. When do we do qualitative research? We do it when we want to know more about the subject of your inquiry. We want to know more than one number, one data collection point. We want to get into there deep and collect really deep information that cannot be expressed by a simple number. Why? Sometimes, a lot of times in qualitative research, we do it because we don't know exactly what we're looking for. It's hard to go ahead and measure something when you don't know what you're supposed to be measuring. For example, in the study on the horseback riding, we didn't know what we were going to find. We didn't know what kind of impact that horseback riding study had on kids with Down syndrome or on kids with cerebral palsy. So a lot of times in qualitative research, we don't know what we're looking for. And it's the emergent nature of qualitative research that allows a lot more flexibility than quantitative research. Because in quantitative research, once you start your study, you cannot stop and you cannot change direction. You have to do the same thing with every participant in your study. Qualitative research, if you find something interesting halfway through, you can change gears and go start looking at that. Oh, excuse me, jumped ahead there a wee bit. So here's a video, and it's linked on the Blackboard site. It's video 1, qualitative versus quantitative research. It's 7 minutes long, and it's the appropriate point in this lecture to look at it because it's a little bit of a humorous view on what we've just discussed on the last 3 or 4 slides. So please, at this point, jump out, watch the video, then come back in to this next slide. So let's put some of that into a table format. When we talk about sample size, in qualitative research we're talking about purposive sample and a small sample. And the reason the sample size is small, a couple of things. Number one, it would be virtually impossible to collect the amount of data we're talking about in a qualitative study on a large sample size. Number two, we really don't care about sample size in qualitative research as much as we do in qualitative research because we're not concerned about generalizability. We have large sample sizes in quantitative research because we have to have a certain power and effect size, and we have to be able to statistically show that we can generalize from the sample to the population. Qualitative research isn't necessarily trying to do that. That's why a small sample size is okay. So along with that, in qualitative research we collect a substantial amount of research per respondent. Quantitative research, that can vary. In quantitative research it can be as simple as bringing someone into a lab setting and collecting one measurement on them very quickly. Qualitative research is a lot more information. Qualitative research does require a lot more special skills in terms of interviewing and data analysis, whereas in quantitative research the data collection is usually pretty quick and any kind of data analysis happens through the computer system software. The type of analysis in qualitative research is descriptive and interpretive, leading it wide open to claims of being subjective, which we'll talk about. Quantitative research considers itself very objective and that the analysis is statistical and not open to any kind of interpretation or subjective bias by whoever's analyzing those data. The hardware used in qualitative research usually involves tape recorders to record interviews, videos, pictures, and software that can help us transcribe and look for emerging themes. In quantitative research, the hardware that is often used are questionnaires, computers, printouts, and then any other kind of hardware that's used to collect our data. In qualitative research, we have a low ability to replicate because each study is unique. In quantitative research, one of the things that we like to do is replicate to build a case that what one person found can be found somewhere else, either with a slightly different test or different sample. The setting for qualitative research is usually the natural real world versus quantitative research where control is deemed very important, and because of that a lot of the research is conducted in a lab type setting. The design of qualitative research is flexible and may change throughout the course of the study. In quantitative research, that design is predetermined, and once you press go and start the study, you have to stick to the plan that was devised. So this is an important slide, so make sure you look over this and listen to it again if you need to understand each comparative dimension and how qualitative compares to quantitative research. So qualitative research, there's several definitions out there. I like this definition by Strauss and Corbin. They simply say that qualitative research is any kind of research that produces findings not arrived at by means of statistical procedures or other means of quantification. So whereas quantitative research talks about causal determinations, predictions, generalizations of findings, in qualitative research we're talking about illumination, understanding, extrapolation, some of those key verbs. So let's define some of the characteristics or features of qualitative research. This is one of the objectives for this lecture. Firstly, qualitative research uses the natural setting as the source of data. The researcher attempts to observe, describe, and interpret settings as they are, maintaining what Patton calls an emphatic neutrality. So that what Patton's referring to there with this emphatic neutrality is that even though the researcher is embedded in the natural setting, that they remain neutral to avoid any kind of bias. Feature number 2. The researcher acts as the human instrument of data collection. So whereas quantitative studies have lots of instruments that collect the data, in qualitative research the researcher is defined as the instrument or the human instrument of data collection. Qualitative reports or manuscripts are descriptive and incorporate expressive language and the presence of voice in the text. So whereas in a quantitative manuscript you won't see words like I, we, they, him, her, nothing personal, and no quotations, in a qualitative manuscript you will see the presence of voice in the text and lots of quotes to kind of highlight what you're discussing. Fourthly, qualitative research has an interpretive character aimed at discovering the meaning events have for individuals who are experiencing them and the interpretations of these meanings by the researcher. And you could see that on several of the examples that I gave you at the start of this lecture and some of the readings that you're going to read to supplement this content. Fifth, qualitative research has an emergent design, and researchers focus on this emerging process as well as the outcomes or the product of the research. So as an emergent design, this goes hand in hand with not knowing what you're going to be looking for sometimes, and then when something pops up you can refocus if you need to. I'll give you an example of this from a study that myself and a couple of colleagues here at UNCW did a few years ago. We were looking at the impact of recess packs in elementary schools. These recess packs were basic big sacks of fun stuff like hula hoops, jump ropes, frisbees, equipment designed to get kids physically active during recess as part of the obesity initiative in the state of North Carolina. So we wanted to go into these schools and speak to the kids, the teachers, principals, and find out if the kids had changed their behaviors during recess as a result of these recess packs being introduced. Now, we could have done a quantitative study and measured physical activity, heart rate, pedometers, accelerometers, BMI changes. We could have done that approach, but we decided we wanted to go and speak to people. And it was going great, and you know, we were finding out, yeah, this is happening, this isn't happening, blah blah blah. And then all of a sudden we started hearing the same thing over and over and over. It came from the kids, it came from the teachers, it came from the principals, and the message was this: if we really want to look at childhood obesity and we really want to use the schools as a vehicle for change, then we not only need to look at physical activity during recess, but we need to look at what they're serving for lunch in the cafeteria. This wasn't the intent of our study. We just wanted to find out if the kids were more physically active. However, once that started emerging, we began to ask more questions about what was being served in the cafeteria, what choices did the kids have, what were they doing, who decided what was on offer in the cafeteria. And then we started, we got into a little bit of policy in terms of who gets the contracts for the school cafeteria and how do they choose the certain types of food groups. So that wasn't the original intent of that study, but because it was qualitative and we recognized the emergent design of qualitative research, that allowed us to move in that direction. Qualitative research is judged using special criteria for trustworthiness, and you'll see this word or concept in the next several slides, trustworthiness. Basically, this is how the quality of qualitative research is judged. Is the findings trustworthiness? And there's certain steps and processes that we can take to try and ensure that our study is robust and meets this trustworthiness issue. So I think this is a good place to stop this part of the lecture. We'll pick it up in the next part of this lecture, talking about selection of participants in qualitative research studies.